everybody. So I'm sorry, I have my voice was a little bit shaky after the long flight. So what I'd like to talk to you about today, it's really the next generation API gateways, or what we see, how we see the market. As Mehdi just said, we acquired a company not so long ago called Reslet, where essentially it's not a pure API management company. They are doing mostly testing, designing of APIs. They have an API gateway with API Spark, but they are really focused on the API lifecycle management. Today we live in a data-driven world. I mean, I think that all of you have mobile phones, and you know how much data that generates every day. And you see explosion of data everywhere. And we see the two worlds of the API and the data coming together. I used to work for a company called Axway before, so I'm familiar with the API solutions and API management. And actually, my first experience with APIs were before that at SAP. I mean, I see some people my age, and maybe some of you guys have coded in ABAP in the past. And the tricky part for SAP was to create mobile application with ABAP calls and function. And obviously, I mean, you don't talk to the mobile developer the same way you talk to the ABAP developer. So on one hand, we had the gray hair, and on the other hand, we have the long hair. And my first experience with the API gateway at the time was how to transform ABAP into REST API so that we can build mobile application. The market has changed dramatically. I mean, if you look at what's on the screen right now, we had the SOA gateways, and they all became at some point API gateways. In markets, we like to change names. So you have companies that change names over time. And then there was a huge round of acquisitions because of the market consolidation. You also had the EDI gateways that transform into B2B gateways. So that was the API gateway, API management world about 4 years ago. And we've seen more consolidation with newer players. So what's the main use case of those gateway? I would say that those gateway are kind of a simple technical gateways. They do routing, they do simple transformation, they manage different protocols. What else do? They provide analytics, they might do throttling, they manage SLA for customers based on APIs. But they are pretty simple type of use cases. When you look at the modern world, there's always disruption. And the API gateways players have been disrupted. So as Mehdi mentioned, I'm part of Talend, and at some point of time, we disrupted the market by pushing open source ETL solution. And the open source market has really disrupted the API gateway. And you see Kong, for example, that came strong, and that disrupted the existing API players. And it's not just that. You have the big players, the cloud players. I remember when Amazon announced the API gateways, a lot of players was, oh, we are doomed. Amazon is going to crush us like they've been crushing everyone since. But no, people have to reinvent themselves. So that's on the open source cloud vendor. You also have different consolidation coming from the application integration player. And what they've done, they took API capabilities, so some of the ones that I mentioned, and they brought them into their core platform. And that's not over. What happened as well is API gateways, as I mentioned, they were simple, but they keep adding functionality. So they say, okay, we see pressure from the left, we see pressure from the right. Let's take a number of new features. Let's push advanced transformation. Let's do complex stuff. The challenge is then the API gateway were kind of overloaded, and then we got into performance problems and so on. So what do we see on the market today? There's a shift. There's clearly a shift. We don't think of API as afterthoughts. API have to come first. And we think really about designing the API first, thinking about the API contract. That's not it. I mean, we really need to think about the API lifecycle from the development to the QA to the deployment, and make sure that all of that is really well integrated into the DevOps world. And what we see here on your right is also what's happening in the market overall on other technology trends. We have microservices. I see some companies here on the left, they deal a lot with those microservices. Who has kids in the room? Okay, a lot of you have kids. I'm sure you have Wi-Fi at home. And it's always funny. I mean, I live in a house and we have walls and the Wi-Fi router is not that strong. And the kids always complain about Wi-Fi. So what did I do is I bought mesh routers. So Google does really good mesh routers. And here you see mesh services coming over. And that's a new generation of proxies and they address network challenges and they make sure that everything is faster. We have more governance, more orchestration. We can do advanced routing. We can do break circuits and all that stuff. So there are a lot of new technology trends, multi-clouds, hybrid environments. So the API world keeps transforming itself. But those are the modern technology that we see today on the market. I'm not expecting you to read every company that you have out there. You have basically 3 different categories or 4 categories. You have the application integration player. To name one big one is MuleSoft. You have the data integration player. The Informatica, the Talend of the world, they are really seeing it data first and not the API first. So that was before, of course. What you have also is the smaller player that address the citizen integrators. So that's what you have on the right bottom corner. And then you have the API management pure players. And what's happening on the market, that's something I stole from Gartner. You really have that consolidation on the market. And the API is really seen as the glue between the data world on one hand and the API world. So why do we need that? Why do we see that innovation in the field? Well, guess what? There are new use cases. It's not just about exposing your financial data so that some guys can build a mobile application or your SAP data and so on. There are many new cases that are coming up in the market. You look at the IoT use cases. You look at the big data use cases. When you think about Uber, they really changed the game. When you think about Netflix, I mean, it's even better. I mean, for us who live in the data world, who live in the microservice world, who live in the API world, I mean, what Netflix has done is absolutely amazing. They really build those, what we call the experience APIs and push the microservices architecture to its full extent. Expectation is great UX when you build up applications. But the tricky part, with great UX, we expect performance, quick responses. When you order your Uber, you want to know where the car is, and sometimes you're watching the car. I mean, I know I do, I travel a lot. And when I don't see the car moving, after a few seconds, I'm going to call the driver and say, are you going to pick me up, or do I need to change and get another driver? And the challenge is there are more governance. And one of the use cases, or 2 of the use cases that you see here, I'm going to drill a little bit into one, which is the GDPR. And GDPR, it's all about that governance. And so it's not just about getting access to the data through APIs and in a fast and efficient way. It's also about being able to trace what's going on. And tracing at the service level up to the data level to its lowest granularity. A GPR use cases. So here you have 3 different personas. You have the business on one hand, who's pushing for, oh, I always need more. I need to generate more revenue. And by the way, I need to be able to do that in 2 weeks. And when you look at the world, the API world or the mobile applications, I mean, the life cycles are shorter and shorter. The businesses are asking more, faster, and even for yesterday, right? Then on the middle, you have that new persona that we hear more and more. That's the governance person. That's the person who's responsible for the data, making sure that the data is secured, making sure that it's traceable, making sure that as a consumer of that data, you are able to say, I want to opt out, or I want to opt in from that service, from that API, from that data. And you need to be able to report on that. So it's at some point of time you have some kind of breach in security, you have to go back and retrace the whole chain. So not just the last call of the API, not just one level, not just one node, but you have to understand everything that happened. And it's not just a route, right? A mediation route. It's more than that. It's also what transformation happened at the gateway level, what transformation happened at the data level itself. And then you have the IT guy, so it's always us. We always have to do everything in a rush. We have to manage, in the previous presentation, it was all about legacy system and how to enable those. Yes, there's that. There's how do we make coexistence of the new microservices with the old world. So all of that is not easy. So what are we saying? What are we saying is we see a new kind of a paradigm or a category. Maybe that's going to become a category emerging, and that's what we call the data gateway. And the data gateway, it's all about bridging the two worlds, bridging the data world and bridging the API world. And it's not about, we are not saying that our company or we will recreate an API management or API gateway or merge services and so on, or new containerization technology. No, we're going to leverage actually a lot of those. But the idea here with the data gateway is to bridge the two worlds. So it's going to be a higher level of functional and or functions on that gateway level. And when you look at the data side, it's to be able to trace end-to-end both the data and what happened to the data with the API. So that's what we call the API governance. It's to be able to give the ability for a complex transformation within the data gateway itself, leveraging the data sets. It's to leverage machine learning to do prediction. I worked with a US healthcare company, and the US healthcare system is very different from the French healthcare system. I would say, maybe some of you will think I'm nuts, but I find the French system fairly easy with the social security and how you manage claim. In the US, it's very complex because there's always a bid. In the US, we are not a patient, we are a customer, and because there's a customer, it's really messy in the background, and people will compete for your business. When you look at the claim, there will be many different people involved. And the data processing behind a claim is extremely complex, but you could do that on the left side at the dataset level and then expose that to the API, but you need to be able to trace it and govern it end to end. So there's many more functionality that we see at the data gateway, but again, it's about bridging the two worlds. So benefits of the data gateway, I'm kind of summarizing that very quickly, but from a business user is to be able to innovate at the business level much faster. For the governance person in the middle, it's to be able to trace that back. It's to be able to write reports. It's to understand everything that happened at the data level, through the network, through the mesh service, to the API at the API level. And for the IT guy, it's all about efficiency and being able to address the business needs much faster. So as I said, the data gateway, it's not about recreating a new API gateway, a new API management solution, and so on. It's about leveraging the ecosystem and leveraging different things. So there's two sides of that picture. On one hand, you have the data sets, and you have the microservices or the domain services. So think of Netflix, maybe not in France, maybe Netflix is not that big of a thing. In the US, pretty much everybody uses Netflix. And Netflix has created those microservices. And so that's really domain expertise. They have hundreds of microservices that are leveraging those huge data sets around movies, around prediction models, and so on. And what you have on the right side here, it's the APIs. And Netflix has created those experience APIs. And not so long ago, we talked with one of the Netflix architects, and he told us that at the API level, there are different APIs that will have same functions, but those APIs are different for different devices. At some point of time, I thought that when I was loading a movie, when I was clicking, thumbs up, thumbs down, and so on, that was the same API. Well, no, because everything is about optimization at the device level, throughout the network, and you might have different implementations of those APIs, but different specification of the APIs themselves. On the back end, of course, those APIs, they might be different, but they are using the same microservices. And here what we see is the convergence of the two through the data gateway that brings on top, so it's really on top, leveraging a lot of the ecosystem technology, providing the governance, providing the traceability, and giving the ability to enrich the data, giving the ability to see when the data is changing. So we move from a pure technical approach with APIs, like we're looking at the technical features of the API versus the business value of data. When you look at the data itself, you can look at what's inside the data. You can look at the semantic of the data. And if that semantic is changing for the same data set or for a microservice, then you might trigger some errors. You might trigger some rules. Things that you can't really do with the API, because with the API, it's mostly you're looking at the volume, you are looking at number of calls, you are looking at whether or not you are meeting SLAs and so on. But when you are at the data level, you can really do some introspection. And with that data gateway, we see those two worlds converging. So stay tuned. I mean, from a company standpoint, we're going to start delivering on those promises. We are mostly working heavily on the data side. But with the acquisition of Reslet, we're going to go much more so on the right side. So just to conclude, before, and I think I still have a couple of minutes. So to conclude, so what are the benefits? Deliver and govern API first data as a service. So how you take data, that data could be a batch, that data could be a complex process, as the example of the claim, but that data can be real time as well, and deliver that as a service, so data as a service, thinking of the API first. Second one is the data gateway. Again, it's not about replacing what already exists, but it's about augmenting the functionality. So still leveraging what's happening at the edge API, so like the Kong type of gateway, but also enrich on the microservices part. And then finally, continue to enrich what we have as that hybrid convergence platform, so bridging the two worlds of the data, API integration with that full data governance. So thank you very much. It's short, but we have some questions.
So Laurent traveled from San Francisco to come here. So yeah, one question here. Question? No, just peace. Right? Question or so after? No?
You talked briefly of your U.S. healthcare customer. Do you see any desire by U.S. companies to be proactive when it comes to GDPR and their data, and be ahead of U.S. regulations, even though it's not doing anything right now? Do you see any inspiration from?
Well, there's a lot of work happening already. I mean, that might not be a regulation such as the one we have in Europe, but there's a lot of regulation around data, because whenever there are data breaches, companies have to say what happened and being able to retrace that. Now, you know, the US is a very pragmatic country, so probably if they are not forced to do that, I mean, knowing that there's a significant cost to implement GDPR, they might not do it right away, but I know regulation is going to come. I think that yesterday, actually, when I landed, we were at a round table and we talked about Meltdown and Spectre, two bugs at the processor level. And I think that this is going to trigger more requests on the US side because of the Intel breach there. And I mean, breach from all the other process makers, but specifically on the Intel side. And that's going to create, I think, more regulation on traceability. Because we often focus only on the software part, but there's a hardware aspect. And when it comes to big lawsuit actions, when people will have to pay millions and millions of dollars, trust me, they're going to start looking at who's guilty and not, and they're going to need this kind of traceability. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yep.
We have time for one more question. I have a question. Oh, yeah, question there? No, just fine. Okay. About governments, right? So the thing RGPD, you know, is mostly, or GDPR in French, is mostly regulation by European institutions. But also there is also data sovereignty, right? Russia, who wants data of Russians to be only on the Russian servers and everything. Do you think? I don't want to know if you have customers in that area. But do you think it will happen in the next years, that this sovereignty movement, then we will need to know also where is the data, where it's treated, right? And where it's let's say, delivered. So, you know, storage, extraction, transfer, load, and everything. Do you think we'll also have a geographical needs about data governance?
We do already today.
Yeah, I know, but do you think it's a trend that will go deeper?
I think it's a trend that that will pretty much go everywhere in the world. I mean, right now it's mostly pushed in Europe. I mean, you see Germany, when you store data, when you process that data, it has to happen on the German soil. And I mean, as a cloud solution provider, we have to have data centers in different regions. I think that with Europe, we have more flexibility here. But if you go in Asia, for example, some countries out there will force you to have your data centers there, both from a storage and processing. And when you look at the whole chain, maybe you are somewhere, you are traveling, but your data resides in another country. At some point, you will have to be able to trace that back and make sure that that processing is not happening where you are currently staying, but where your data is. So to answer your question very shortly, I think yes, we're going to see governments taking more ownership of the data because of potential breaches and so on. So it's going to expand. Yeah, it's going to expand. Great, thank you, Laurent. Thank you very much. Yeah. So.